He didn't know I'd left the door to the safe wide open on purpose. I watched him celebrate a victory that was already rotting from the inside. He thought he was stealing my promotion, but he was actually signing his own prison sentence. I didn't say a word. The office at Sterling and how always smelled of expensive cedar and the faint, ozone scent of high-end printers. It was a quiet environment, the kind of place where careers were made in whispers and destroyed in the margins of a spreadsheet. My cousin Julian fit the decor perfectly. He was 3 years older, broader in the shoulders, and possessed a smile that seemed to promise you a seat at the table while he was busy sawing the legs off your chair. "Mickey, focus," Julian said, his voice dropping into that familiar, paternal register. He leaned over my desk, tapping a manicured finger on my monitor. "The Sullivan account isn't about the data, it's about the story. You're getting bogged down in the how again. Let me handle the narrative." That was his signature tactic. The translation: he never told me I was wrong. He simply suggested I was too technical, too behind the scenes to understand the sunlight. He had been translating my work to the board for 2 years. Every time a promotion cycle neared, Julian would find a way to frame my contributions as the necessary, yet mundane, labor that supported his visionary leadership. I didn't argue. I never did. I simply pulled up the next set of projections. "The architecture for the new logistics platform is finished," I said softly. I didn't look at him. I looked at the flickering cursor. "It's aggressive. It cuts overhead by 20% in the first quarter, but the integration phase is delicate." Julian leaned in closer, the scent of his colon something metallic and sharp filling my space. "Delicate is just another word for slow. Mickey, the partners want disruptive. If we don't show them a shark, they'll think we're minnows." He reached out and squeezed my shoulder. It was a gesture meant to look like camaraderie to anyone passing by, but the grip was tight, a physical reminder of the hierarchy. "I'll take the files home tonight. I want to tweak the presentation for the Monday briefing. You've done the heavy lifting. Go get some air. You look gray." I watched his reflection in the darkened glass of my monitor. He wasn't looking at the files. He was looking at me, checking for any spark of resistance. I gave him nothing. I gave him a tired, compliant nod. "The master file is on the shared drive," I said. I labeled it final_V4. It has everything. The growth models, the automated tax routing, the offshore projections. It's all there. "Good lad," Julian said. He didn't even wait for me to pack my bag before he was at his own desk, his fingers flying across the keys as he moved my work into a folder with his name on it. I sat there for another hour, long after he had left. The office grew dark, the city lights of Chicago beginning to hum through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I opened a different folder on my private drive. It was titled Project Icarus. In the final_V4 file Julian had just taken, there was a hidden flaw. It wasn't a mistake, not exactly. It was a series of calculations based on a tax loophole that the federal government had quietly closed 3 days ago. I knew about the change because I had been monitoring the legislative feed. Julian hadn't. He didn't read the fine print. He only read the headlines. If he presented those projections as his own, he wouldn't just be wrong. He would be proposing a strategy that was technically a felony. I checked my email. A message from a recruiter at Van Slidell, Sterling's primary competitor, sat in my inbox. They had been headhunting me for months. They didn't want a storyteller. They wanted the man who built the engine. I typed a short, 3-word reply: "I am ready." As I left the building, I passed the security desk. The guard, an older man named Ray, nodded to me. "Late night, Mickey, just making sure everything is where it needs to be, Ray," I said. I walked out into the cool evening air. I felt lighter than I had in years. Julian thought he had spent the last 2 years climbing over me. He didn't realize I had spent that time building the ladder, and I had made sure the top rung wasn't attached to anything at all. I looked back at the glowing logo of Sterling and how, on Monday, that logo would be a target, and for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be standing in front of it to take the hit. The weekend was a masterclass in choreographed silence. While Julian spent his Saturday posting photos from a high-end golf club captioning a shot of a Scotch glass with preparing the vision for Monday's board meeting, I spent mine in a nondescript coffee shop 3 blocks away from my apartment. I wasn't looking at golf courses. I was looking at the fine print of a non-compete clause that Julian had pressured me into signing a year ago. He had told me it was standard procedure for family, a way to protect our collective future. What Julian didn't realize was that a non-compete is only as strong as the company's standing. If the company's leadership is found to be advocating for fraudulent financial structures, the contract becomes a fragile thing. Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. Mickey, looking at the tax routing numbers in V4. These projections are insane. If this holds, the partners are going to give us the keys to the kingdom. You're sure about the Section 409A compliance? I stared at the screen. This was the moment. This was the point where I could have saved him. I could have told him about the legislative update that had rendered Section 409A a legal minefield for the exact structure he was about to propose. I could have told him that the insane projections were only possible if one ignored the newly minted federal oversight. I took a slow breath. My heart rate steady, my hands cool. I typed back. The data in that file reflects exactly what we discussed. It's the most aggressive path to growth. Like you said, the partners want a shark. His reply was instantaneous. Exactly. Leave the talking to me tomorrow. Just sit there and look like the genius who crunched the numbers. We're going to be legends. Legends, I whispered to the empty room. Monday morning arrived with a kind of oppressive gray sky that makes the glass towers of Chicago look like tombstones. I dressed with more care than usual. Not in a power suit. Julian hated it when I tried to look managerial, but in a clean, understated navy blazer. I wanted to look like the reliable, invisible technician he had trained the world to see. When I walked into the boardroom, the tension was already a physical weight. The senior partners, men with names like Sterling and Howe, who spoke in the measured tones of old money, were already seated. Julian was at the head of the long mahogany table, fiddling with the HDMI cable. He looked radiant. He wore a suit that cost more than my first car, and his hair was slicked back with the precision of a man who believed the world was his mirror. "Ah, Mickey, glad you could join us," Julian said, his voice projecting for the benefit of the partners. He gave me a condescending pat on the arm. "Take a seat back there by the water carafe. If the partners have any deep dive technical questions, I'll throw them your way." The translation was in full effect. He was signaling to the room that I was his subordinate, his tool, a quiet extension of his own brilliance. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice barely a murmur. I took my seat at the far end of the table. The presentation began. Julian was a performer. He dimmed the lights, and the screen came alive with the Project Icarus slides. He had changed the branding, of course. My name was nowhere to be found. It was the Julian Vance strategy for exponential growth. For 20 minutes, I watched him spin a web of gold. He spoke about the logistics platform, the automated routing, and finally, the centerpiece, the tax shelter architecture. He showed them the 20% overhead reduction. He showed them the offshore growth. He was charming, witty, and utterly dominant. I watched Mr. Sterling, the founding partner, lean forward. Sterling was a man who had built his reputation on impeccable ethics, mostly because he was smart enough never to get caught. "Julian," Sterling interrupted, his voice like dry parchment. "These numbers, they depend entirely on the overseas tax routing structure described on slide 14. You're certain of the legality under the new federal guidelines?" Julian didn't miss a beat. He gave a short, dismissive laugh, the social tactic he used to make anyone questioning him feel like an amateur. "Mr. Sterling, I've spent the weekend vetting this personally. The guidelines are suggestions. The code is the law. We are well within the margin. Mickey here has double-checked the math, haven't you, Mickey?" Every head in the room turned to me. This was the public betrayal. Julian wasn't just taking credit for the work. He was using me as a human shield. If it worked, he was the visionary. If it failed, he had just put on the record that I was the one who had verified the math. I looked at Julian. He was smiling, that confident, predatory glint in his eyes. He thought he had me trapped in the same silence I had occupied for years. "The math in the file is accurate to the parameters we set, Julian," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of any tremor. "See," Julian turned back to the board, spreading his hands wide. "Precision is our hallmark. We aren't just looking at the next quarter. We're looking at the next decade." He then did something I hadn't expected. He pulled up a final slide. It was a mock-up of the new corporate structure. His name was at the top. My name was listed under technical support. Below that was a list of 3 junior analysts he intended to fire to streamline the transition. "This is the future of Sterling and Howe," Julian declared. "A lean, aggressive machine, led by those who understand the narrative of the modern market." The room was silent. Julian took a sip of water, basking in what he thought was awe. I looked down at my watch. It was 10:14 a.m. In exactly 1 minute, the company-wide email server would receive my formal resignation. In 2 minutes, an anonymous tip sent from a burner phone on Saturday would reach the compliance office of the SEC. detailing a concerning financial proposal being presented at Sterling, and how this very morning. But that wasn't the end. The real beauty of it was the back door I had left in the presentation software. "Julian," I said softly. He looked annoyed at being interrupted during his victory lap. "Yes, Mickey, we're a bit busy here. I think there's a glitch on slide 15, I said. Julian frowned and turned toward the screen. I tapped a small remote in my Pokita, simple Bluetooth clicker synced to the laptop he had borrowed from me. The slide didn't change to a graph. Instead, the screen flickered and displayed a private chat log. It was a series of messages between Julian and his girlfriend from 3 weeks ago. "Don't worry about the vacation costs," the screen read in giant, high-definition letters. "I'm just going to have Mickey fudge the R&D write-offs again. He's too quiet to notice, and the board is too old to understand the software. I've got them in my pocket." The silence in the boardroom transitioned from professional to lethal. Julian's face went from a healthy, tanned glow to the color of wet ash. He lunged for the laptop, but in his panic, he tripped over the HDMI cable, yanking it from the socket. The screen went black, but the damage was burned into the retinas of every partner in the room. I stood up slowly. I didn't look at Julian. I didn't look at the partners. I simply tucked my chair back into its perfectly aligned position. "I think that covers the narrative you wanted to share, Julian," I said. I walked toward the door. "Mickey." Julian found his voice, though it was an octave higher than usual, cracked and desperate. "Mickey, what is this? What did you do?" I stopped at the door and turned back. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at him with the same blank, helpful expression I had worn for years. "I didn't do anything, Julian. I just gave you exactly what you asked for. You wanted to be the one to tell the story. I just made sure the ending was accurate." As I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed. It was an automated notification. My resignation had been processed. I walked to the elevator. I could hear the shouting start behind the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. But the sound was muffled, distant like a storm happening on a different continent. I stepped into the elevator and pressed G. As the doors began to close, I saw Julian burst out of the boardroom, his tie askew, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He saw me. He ran toward the closing doors. "Mickey, wait, we can fix this. Tell them it was a joke. Tell them." The doors slid shut with a soft, expensive hiss. I was alone in the mirrored box, descending quietly toward the street. I looked at my reflection. I didn't look gray anymore. When the doors opened at the lobby, I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the courier desk. I had a package to pick up, a signing bonus from Vance Liddell, and a new set of credentials. But as I walked, I realized I had forgotten one thing. I hadn't checked the news. I pulled out my phone and saw a headline that made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't about Sterling and Howe. It was about the very firm I was about to join. The question was, had I just jumped from a sinking ship onto a burning one? Or was this the second phase of a plan I hadn't even realized I was executing? The headline on the financial feed was stark: Vance Liddell facing internal audit amid allegations of intellectual property theft. I stood in the marble lobby of my former life, the weight of the signing bonus in my satchel, feeling suddenly like lead. The irony was almost poetic. I had spent months courting a rival firm to escape Julian's shadow, only to find that the superior alternative was embroiled in its own brand of rot. For a moment, the old Mikitha one, who relied on the safety of a corporate structure, felt a surge of panic. But the new Mickey, the one who had just dismantled a legacy in a single boardroom session, simply tightened his grip on his phone. I didn't go to the courier desk. I walked out of the building and into the biting Chicago wind. The next 6 weeks were a study in invisibility. To the world, I had vanished. Julian was the story now. The fallout from the Icarus presentation had been swift and merciless. Because he had insisted on taking full credit for the flawed tax structure, the partners had no choice but to make him the scapegoat to protect the firm's charter. He wasn't just fired. He was being sued for gross negligence. I, meanwhile, had moved into a small, short-term rental in a neighborhood where no one wore Italian suits. I kept my phone off. I spent my days in the public library, using their terminals to map out the connections between Sterling and Howe and Vance Liddell. What I found was a spiderweb. Vance Liddell wasn't just a rival. They were a mirror. The IP theft allegations mentioned in the news involved a logistics algorithm that looked remarkably like a prototype I had developed 3 years ago, one that Julian had lost during a server migration. It became clear Julian had just been stealing my work to boost his career at Sterling, and how he had been selling the surplus to the highest bidder. He was a double agent of mediocrity, and I had been his unwitting supplier. I sat in the dim light of the library, the hum of the cooling fans, the only soundtrack to my realization. The betrayal was deeper than a stolen promotion. It was a systematic harvest of my intellect. I opened a fresh spreadsheet. I didn't title it. I didn't need to. October 12th. I initiated contact with the Van Sledol audit team. I didn't send them a resume. I sent them a forensic breakdown of the stolen algorithm, proving its origin through a series of embedded digital fingerprints. Subtle coding habits that were as unique to me as a retina scan. October 28th. I received a private invitation to meet with Sarah Vance, the daughter of the founder and the head of their legal department. She wasn't interested in the story. She was interested in survival. I met her in a quiet diner, the kind of place where the coffee is burnt and the booths provide her back to privacy. She looked tired, her eyes sharp but shadowed by the stress of a looming federal investigation. "You're Mickey," she said, not as a question. She laid a folder on the table. "Your fingerprints are all over our core logistics engine." The engine we've been told was an original acquisition from an independent consultant named Julian Vance. "He's my cousin," I said. I watched a drop of condensation slide down my water glass. "And he didn't sell you the engine. He sold you a stolen blueprint that he didn't know how to finish. Which is why it's crashing," Sarah said, leaning in. "We'd be facing a $100 million class action suit from our shipping partners because the routing logic is failing. If we can't fix it, the firm folds by Christmas." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I can fix it. But I don't want a job." Sarah frowned. "Then what do you want?" "I want the debt," I said. I explained the plan. I would finish the code, stabilizing Van Sledol's infrastructure and saving the firm from collapse. In exchange, Van Sledol would purchase the outstanding litigation debt that Sterling and Howe was currently using to crush Julian. In the eyes of the law, Van Sledol would become Julian's primary creditor. They would own him. And because I would be the one holding the keys to Van Sledol's new, functional engine, I would, by extension, own the hand that held Julian's leash. "You're asking me to spend millions to bail out the man who defrauded us," Sarah whispered. "No," I corrected her. "I'm asking you to buy an asset. Julian is a man who fears two things: exposure and loss of control. You're going to give him both. You'll keep him on as a consultant to save face for the firm. But his entire salary, his assets, and his professional life will be managed by a blind trust. And who manages the trust?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The weeks that followed were a blur of high-intensity coding. I worked from a secure terminal in Sarah's office. I didn't talk to the staff. I didn't attend meetings. I was a ghost in the machine, fixing the errors Julian had introduced when he tried to tweak my logic to hide his theft. As I worked, I watched the news of Julian's descent. He had lost his apartment. His influential friends had vanished. He was a pariah, a cautionary tale of the arrogant era of Chicago finance. Every time I felt a flicker of pity, I remembered the way his grip felt on my shoulder when he told me I looked gray. I remembered the chat logs where he called me too stupid to notice he was selling my life's work. On November 15th, the project was complete. The Van Sledol engine was humming, more efficient than anything on the market. The lawsuits were being settled out of court. The firm was saved. I stood in Sarah's office as she signed the final paperwork for the debt acquisition. "It's done," she said. She looked at me with a mixture of respect and genuine fear. "We own Julian Vance. Everything he earns for the next 20 years belongs to the trust. He has been notified he has to report for his first day of consulting tomorrow." "Does he know who he's reporting to?" I asked. "The contract says he reports to the lead architect," Sarah replied. "He hasn't been given a name yet." I nodded and walked to the window. Below, the city was beginning to dress for the holidays. Lights were being strung up on Michigan Avenue. It was the season of homecoming and family. I thought about the family dinners we used to have, where Julian would hold court at the head of the table while I sat at the end, the quiet one who did okay for himself. I thought about the way he used to laugh when he'd interrupt my stories. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The revenge wasn't in the destruction. Julian was still alive. He still had a job. He still had his reputation, tenuously held together by the very firm he had betrayed. The revenge was in the permanent, quiet weight of the truth. He would spend the rest of his career working to pay back a debt to a ghost. I checked my reflection in the window. I looked healthy. I looked rested. I picked up my satchel and headed for the door. "Mickey," Sarah called out. "Are you coming in tomorrow?" I paused at the door. "I'll be there. I want to see his face when he realizes he is not the one telling the story anymore." The realization hit me as I entered the elevator. I had spent my life being the hidden part of her hidden heart. But as the floor numbers ticked down, I realized that once you stop hiding your heart, You have to decide what to do with the person who tried to break it. I had Julian in a cage of his own making, but a cage requires a keeper. And I had to ask myself, by binding him to me, was I actually setting myself free, or was I just building a better prison for both of us? The lobby of Vance Ladol was a cathedral of glass and steel, designed to make the individual feel small and the institution feel eternal. I arrived at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the official start of the workday. I didn't use the main entrance. I used the executive keycard Sarah Vance had issued me the night before. I sat in the lead architect's office, a glass-walled sanctuary that overlooked the entire development floor. From here, one could see every workstation, every flickering monitor, and the coffee station where the morning's gossip usually coagulated. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I sat in the soft, gray morning light, watching the city wake up. At 8:05 a.m., I saw him, Julian, walk through the main glass doors with a gait that attempted to project his old confidence, but the seams were showing. His suit was the same one he'd worn to the Sterling, and how disastered likely because his others were in a storage unit he could no longer afford. He kept adjusting his tie, his head darting left and right, looking for a familiar face, a friendly smile, or perhaps a predator. He didn't find any of the three. The employees at Vance Ladol knew him only as the consultant, whose presence was a legal necessity. To them, he was a ghost of a scandal they were trying to outrun. I watched him approach the reception desk. He spoke to the receptionist, his hands gesturing expansively, likely trying to charm her into giving him more information than she had. She didn't smile back. She pointed toward the elevators, her expression as flat as a dial tone. He entered the elevator, and a few moments later, I heard the heavy thud of the double doors at the end of the executive wing. Julian, Sarah's voice rang out from the hallway. You're late. Traffic on the Kennedy was a nightmare. Sarah, Julian's voice boomed, trying to reclaim the room. But I'm here now, ready to roll up my sleeves and get this ship back on course. I've been looking over the preliminary audit notes, and I think I've found a few areas where we can optimize. You're not here to optimize, Julian, Sarah interrupted. Her voice was ice. You're here to fulfill the terms of your restructuring agreement. Your office is at the end of the hall. You'll be reporting directly to our lead architect. He has your first set of tasks. Lead architect. Since when did Vance Ladol hire a lead architect? I thought I was brought in to oversee the transition. You were brought in because you owe this firm $42 million in damages and lost IP value, Sarah said. I could hear the rustle of paper. The debt transfer agreement. You are an employee of the trust now, Julian. You work until the debt is settled. Now go. He's waiting. I heard Julian's footsteps. They were slower now, heavy with the realization that he was no longer the smartest person in the room. He reached my door. He paused. Through the frosted glass, I could see his silhouette, the broad shoulders, the perfectly coiffed hair standing still, trying to regain his visionary posture. He knocked 3 sharp, confident raps. Come in, I said. The door opened. Julian stepped in, a practiced smile already forming on his lips, his hand already extended for a power play handshake. Listen, I'm looking forward to getting to work with you. I think we can really. The sentence died in his throat. His hand stayed frozen in midair. The smile didn't just fade. It collapsed, leaving his face looking strangely vacant, like a house that had been gutted by fire, while the facade remained intact. Mickey, he whispered. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer my hand. I simply pointed to the chair across from my desk. Sit down, Julian. We have a lot of data to clean up. He didn't sit. He took a step back, his eyes darting to the door, then back to me, then to the nameplate on the desk that read M. Vance, lead architect. What is this? He stammered. Is this a joke? Sarah is in a board meeting, I said calmly. And this isn't a joke. It's a recovery phase. You sold Vance Ladol, a corrupted version of my logistics engine, because you didn't understand the underlying calculus. You introduced 312 logic gates that are currently causing a recursive loop in their shipping manifests. You're going to help me find every single one of them. Julian's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, rage, and finally, a desperate, hollow kind of laughter. You think you can do this? You think you can just buy me? I'm your family. Mickey, I looked out for you. You looked at me. I corrected him. You never looked out for me. You looked at me and saw a resource. You saw a quiet man you could use as a foundation for a house you didn't know how to build. I opened a file on my monitor and turned the screen toward him. It was a list of his personal assets, all of them now under the control of the trust. His car, his apartment, his 401k, even the golf club membership he had bragged about on that final Sunday. Every dollar you earn from today until you retire goes toward fixing the damage you caused, I said. You'll have a modest stipend for rent and groceries. The rest belongs to the engine. Julian finally sank into the chair. He looked small. The expensive suit seemed to swallow him. You planned this? From the boardroom? No, from before that. You let me take the files. I didn't let you do anything, Julian. I just stopped stopping you. I realized that your greatest fear wasn't being caught. Cliff was being seen for exactly what you are. An empty room. I'll quit, he hissed, a spark of his old arrogance returning. I'll go to the press. I'll tell them Vansladal is being run by a sociopath who's holding his own cousin hostage. You can certainly try, I said, leaning back. But you signed the family protection agreement, remember? The one you told me was standard procedure. Paragraph 12 states that any public disparagement of the firm or its principals results in an immediate acceleration of the debt. They'll seize your parents' house. Julian, I believe they co-signed your initial loan at Sterling. He turned gray. Not the gray he used to mock me with, but a dull ashen color that suggested he was finally seeing the walls of the maze. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice barely audible. I want you to do what you've always done, I said. I want you to sit in the office next to mine. I want you to read the technical manuals I give you. And when I need someone to present the narrative of why we are failing to meet our targets this month, you will go down to the floor and you will tell them exactly what I tell you to say. I handed him a stack of printouts. 500 pages of raw, unoptimized code. Start with the error logs on page 1, I said. I expect a summary by 5 o'clock. Don't worry about the story, Julian. Just focus on the how. He took the papers. His hands were shaking, just a little. He stood up and walked toward the door. But before he left, he turned back. You're a monster, Mickey, he said. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. Just the quiet, steady hum of a machine that was finally working perfectly. No, Julian, I said. I'm just the architect. You're the one who provided the materials. As he closed the door, I looked at my watch. It was 8:45 a.m. The workday had officially begun. I began to type, the sound of the keys, a rhythmic, soothing pulse. But as I worked, a thought drifted through my mind, unbidden and cold. I had one. I had everything. But in the silence of my new office, I wondered if I had simply become the person I had spent my life trying to outrun. I looked at the door to Julian's new office. It was made of the same glass as mine. I could see him sitting there, his head in his hands. He looked like a prisoner. And then I looked at my own hands. They were steady. They were controlled. But they were also the only hands that knew how to keep the prison running. The following months were not defined by a single explosion, but by the slow, rhythmic grinding of a machine. Julian occupied the office next to mine, like a ghost in a gilded cage. He arrived at 8 a.m., he left at 6 p.m., and he spoke only when spoken to. The man who once filled every room with the scent of expensive cologne, and the sound of his own laughter had become a shadow. His brilliance revealed to be nothing more than a series of borrowed reflections. The day of the annual Vansladal Shareholders Gala arrived in late December. It was the crowning moment for the firm, the public declaration that the glitches were gone, and the new era of logistics had arrived. Sarah Vance had insisted I attend. She wanted the architect to be seen. I stood in the corner of the ballroom, a glass of mineral water in my hand. I watched Julian. He had been assigned a specific role for the evening. He was the Director of Legacy Integration. It was a title I had invented. It sounded important, but it meant he was responsible for explaining to angry legacy clients why their old, flawed contracts, the ones he had originally sold them, were being systematically dismantled. I saw him standing near the buffet, cornered by an old contact from Sterling and Howe. Julian was trying to play the part, trying to use that old social habit of dismissive charm. It's a transition phase, Arthur, Julian said, his voice straining to find its old resonance. We're just recalibrating the vision. You know how it is, sometimes you have to break the engine to make it scream. Is that what happened, Julian? I asked, stepping out of the shadows. Julian froze. The client, Arthur, looked at me with curiosity. Mickey, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. I was just explaining the strategy. The strategy is simple, Arthur, I said, looking the client in the eye. We found a series of fundamental errors in the original logic. We've spent the last quarter removing the rot. Julian has been instrumental in identifying exactly where the errors originated. The translation had flipped. I was now the one framing Julian's narrative. I wasn't being cruel. I was being precise. I watched Julian's jaw tighten. He knew that if he corrected me, if he tried to reclaim his dignity, I would simply pull the technical audit from my pocket. "Excuse us, Arthur," I said politely. "Julian and I have a briefing to prepare for." I led Julian toward the balcony, away from the hum of the crowd. The winter air was sharp, cutting through the warmth of the ballroom. Below us, the city lights twinkled like cold diamonds. "How much longer, Mickey?" Julian asked. He didn't look at me. He looked at the horizon. The debt, the offices, this performance. How much longer? The debt is a mathematical reality, Julian. Based on your current salary and the interest on the damages, you'll be clear in about 18 years. Julian let out a short, hollow laugh. 18 years of being your puppet. 18 years of you standing over my shoulder, waiting for me to trip. I'm not waiting for you to trip, Julian, I said softly. I'm making sure you never have to. I've built a world where you can fail because you are allowed to build anything. You wanted to be a legend. Now, you're a monument to accuracy. He turned to face me then. For the first time, the mask was gone. There was no charm, no manipulation, just a raw, naked exhaustion. "You think you won," Julian whispered. "But look at you. You don't enjoy the money. You don't care about the title. You spend 14 hours a day in a dark room fixing things that are broken, just to prove you can. You've turned your entire life into a reaction to me." I didn't answer immediately. I thought about my apartment empty, clean, and silent. I thought about the recruiter's emails I ignored, and the friends I no longer called because they reminded me of the time before the Icarus project. "You think I'm the one in the cage," Julian continued, a small, genuine smile touching his lips, one that wasn't for the public. "But you're the one holding the bars. You can't leave, Mickey, because if you leave, I might start breathing again. And you can't have that, can you?" I looked at him, and for a second, the power shift wavered. He had found the one flaw in my architecture. The architect is just as tied to the building as the foundation is. "The difference, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the wind, "is that I know why I'm here. You still think you're a victim of bad luck. I'm a student of my own choices." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. I held it out to him. "What is this?" he asked. "It's the final patch for the logistics engine," I said. "It automates the remaining manual tasks you've been doing. If you install this, your workload drops to almost nothing. You'll have 8 hours a day to sit in that office and do whatever you want. You can read, you can stare at the wall, or you can try to start again." Julian reached for it, but I pulled it back. "But if you take it," I said, "I leave. I resign from Van Slidell tonight. The trust remains, the debt remains, but the keeper goes away. You'll report to Sarah Vance directly. She doesn't have my patience. She won't translate for you. If you fail under her, there is no safety net. You'll go to prison for the original fraud." I watched him. This was the ultimate reveal. I was offering him the one thing he always claimed he wanted: independence. But I was also offering him the one thing he feared most: the consequences of his own mediocrity without me there to hide them. Julian looked at the drive. He looked at me. "You're leaving?" he asked. There was a tremor in his voice. It wasn't relief, it was terror. "The project is finished, Julian. I've done the math. There's nothing left to solve here." He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping his hair into a mess. He looked at the drive, then at the ballroom where Sarah Vance was laughing with a senator. He knew that without me, he was just a man who had stolen a dream he couldn't maintain. He reached out and slowly, deliberately, pushed the drive back toward me. "Keep it," he whispered. "I'll see you in the office tomorrow, Mickey." He turned and walked back into the warmth of the gala, his shoulders hunching as he disappeared into the crowd. I stayed on the balcony. I looked at the drive in my hand, the key to my own freedom. I had given him the choice to be free, and he had chosen the cage because the cage was the only thing that kept him relevant. I had won. I had delivered justice. But as I stood there in the cold, I realized that Julian was right about one thing. Justice isn't a destination. It's a career. 3 years have passed since the night on the balcony. The city of Chicago looks the same from the high windows of Van Slidell, but the interior of the firm has changed. It is quieter now. The frantic energy of visionary growth has been replaced by the steady, unrelenting hum of a machine that never sleeps. I am no longer the lead architect. I am a partner. My name is on the glass, just below Sarah's. Julian still has the office next to mine. He is 40 now, though he looks 50. The charm has finally evaporated, replaced by a permanent weary competence. He has become a master of the mundane. He handles the filings, the compliance reports, and the low-level technical audits. He does them well because he knows I am checking the logs every Friday at 5 p.m. We don't speak of the past. We don't speak of family. Our relationship is a series of transactional nods and brief, professional emails. Last Tuesday, I found him in the break room, staring at a flyer for a family reunion, being held by our aunt in Ohio. It was the first time I had seen him look at anything related to our lives before the Icarus project. "Are you going?" I asked, pouring a cup of black coffee. Julian didn't look up. He traced the edge of the paper with a finger that no longer bore a designer ring. I told them I have a deadline. They wouldn't understand why I can't leave the city, Mickey. They still think I'm the big success in the family. My mother tells the neighbors I'm running the firm. And you let her believe that, I said. It wasn't a question. It's the only currency I have left, he replied. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were hollow, reflecting the fluorescent lights above us. You gave me everything I ever wanted, didn't you? The title, the office, the reputation. You just took away the soul of it. I didn't take it, Julian. You traded it for a shortcut. I set my coffee down and walked toward the door. I had a meeting with the SEC to discuss our new transparency protocols, the very protocols that ensured no one like Julian could ever rise through the ranks again. Mickey, he called out. I paused. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stolen the file? He asked. If I had just asked for your help. I thought about the young man I used to be, the one who sat in the shadows and waited for a scrap of recognition. I thought about the silence I used to inhabit, a silence born of fear rather than power. I don't wonder about if, Julian. I'm an architect. I only deal with what is built. I left him there, standing by the coffee machine with a flyer for a life he can never return to. The debt is nearly paid now. In another year, the trust will dissolve. Julian will be a free man with a clean record and a decade of high-level experience at a top-tier firm. He could leave. He could take his knowledge and start over somewhere where no one knows his name or his crimes. But I know he won't. He has become addicted to the structure I built for him. He fears the world outside the cage more than he hates the man who put him in it. He needs me to check his work. He needs me to tell him he's accurate. He has traded his arrogance for a safe, well-lit dependency. As for me, I have achieved everything I set out to do. There was no shouting. There was no violence. There was only the slow, inevitable alignment of reality with the truth. I sat back in my chair and opened the evening's performance reports. The logistics engine was running at 99.9% efficiency. The numbers were perfect. The architecture was flawless. But as I looked at the reflection of the office in the dark window, I noticed something. I didn't look like the victim anymore. I looked like the man I had replaced. I looked like a person who understood the narrative perfectly. I picked up my pen and began to sign the documents for the next quarter. They finally understood. I didn't explain further. Some truths don't need witnesses.